Welcome to the New York State Council of Churches Public Policy Series. My name is the Reverend Peter Cook, and I serve as Executive Director of the Council. And tonight I will be hosting a seminar on climate and environmental justice. We will together look at climate and environmental justice through an anti-racist and theological lens while describing the contours of pending state bills to be considered by the 2023 New York State Legislature. We will also discuss ways that congregations can access clean energy and solar technology to improve their property while sharing the benefits of community solar with renters, homeowners, and affordable housing developments in their community. So let's begin. First, I would like to invite Sister Catherine Darcy, Justice Resource Manager for the Sisters of Mercy Justice Team in New York State, to share with us highlights of Pope Francis's groundbreaking encyclical, Laudato Si. Catherine?
Thank you, Peter. And good evening, everyone. Laudato Si, translated "Praise be to you," are the first words of this 2015 encyclical letter from Pope Francis, written a little over 2 years after he took office. The subtitle of this letter is "On the Care of Our Common Home." Often, a Pope's encyclicals are directed only toward Catholics. However, Francis addresses this encyclical to every person living on the planet. That is Francis' way of saying, we are all in this together. In his introduction to the letter, Francis credits his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, who invites us to see nature as a magnificent book in which God speaks to us and grants us a glimpse of God's infinite beauty and goodness. Later on in the encyclical, Francis acknowledges the centrality of Christ in a Christian understanding of the world. The destiny of all creation is bound up with the mystery of Christ, present from the very beginning. All things have been created through him and for him. Francis calls for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of the planet, as well as a new and universal solidarity. Pope Francis tells us, all of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. You will see again that we are all in this together. And hopefully the outcomes of the COP27 held in Egypt in November will result in a greater universal solidarity. For Francis, this universal solidarity extends beyond humankind. We need to recognize that we are all in relationship with the smallest of creatures. Francis says, the human person grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships, going out from themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. In his first chapter, Francis grieves over what is happening to our common home. He says that the earth, our home, is beginning to look more like an immense pile of filth. Francis says that we are called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it. Changes in lifestyle, production, and consumption of electricity. Is that not why we are here tonight? Francis looks at the big picture in this encyclical letter. He then advocates for the protection of biodiversity and decries irreversible damage incurred in tropical rainforests of Brazil and the Congo, the lungs of planet Earth. However, the big picture for Francis also includes the global inequality of its inhabitants. Francis says the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to the causes related to human and social degradation. He goes on to quote the Bolivian bishops who say, both everyday experience and scientific research show that the greatest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. Let me say that again. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. Thus, Francis maintains a conviction of the inseparability of the earthly environment from one's social environment. He then proposes an integral ecology, that is, an ecology which respects its human and social dimensions. Francis teaches us it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. For this reason, Francis contends that strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. A fundamental principle Francis espouses in this letter is that of the common good, which he describes as the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to that which they need for their own fulfillment. Francis says that whenever the common good is violated, violence always ensues. Society as a whole, and the state in particular, are obliged to defend and promote the common good. What is good needs to be common for all. All are able to access that which they need, not merely to survive, but to thrive. Francis considers the common good not as a static concept. Rather, the common good for Francis is not what is common and good for only today, but that which will be common and good for future generations. Francis asks, what kind of a world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children now growing up? Perhaps that is also why we are here this evening. We find ourselves asking the same question. What do we want to leave behind to future New Yorkers, as well as future members of the global society? Toward the end of Laudato Si, Francis makes note of an important Christian virtue that needs to be fostered in an effort to embrace needed ecological conversion. That is the virtue of humility. Francis says, once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. In humility, we acknowledge what we do not know and all that we do not know all the answers by ourselves. We seek the advice of others, and we take responsibility for our actions. Is it not fascinating that the root for the word humility is humus, earth itself? Indeed, it takes humility to see creation as God sees creation, the order of love. And so let us pray. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect your world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing and to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. Thank you.
In the spirit of Laudato Si, we are called to care for the earth and every human and living thing which dwells on the planet. When it comes to environmental and climate justice, there is no greater offense to God's intention for the planet than environmental racism. Environmental racism is about predominantly Black communities being asked to bear the health costs of toxins in the air and water and in the ground, and also because of ill-conceived public works projects which benefit richer communities. A vivid example of environmental racism can be found in the South End in Albany. Here is a recent documentary, Airing the Truth, Pollution and Health at Ezra Prentice Homes, which tells an all too common story of environmental racism in the United States.
I can't hear you. What do we want? Fossil fuels have gotta go. Fossil fuels have gotta go.
When we have people in our community who have to endure cancer and health problems because they have trucks 1,000 a day running in front of their house down on the South End, and they are stuck, that is wrong.
So as we continue this march, and we are chanting about climate justice and the global economy that we live in, let us not forget the local fight that happens every single day.
Down here is like part of our wardrobe, our inhalers and stuff.
All my life living down here. I'm 33 years old and I've always had asthma and all my kids got it too.
The influence of geography is both the natural landscape and also the built environment, what we as humans have done to the environment. But then there's also the component of policy. So when we're going to build a public housing complex, we're using taxpayer money, and we are not going to put that on the most expensive land. Right? It's unlikely to be a waterfront property. And in fact, we'll put it on the cheapest land, which is also where people put factories. It's also where, in the case of Ezra Prentice, it's by the port. And so they have all the traffic going to the port, both the trains and the trucks. They built it near the port because that land was available at a price that the county would pay.
On March 27, 1962, residents and business owners of this neighborhood were told their properties had been appropriated by the state via eminent domain for the future site of the Empire State Plaza.
It was disturbing in the fact that you had no idea if you were ever going to see the friends that you had made there.
Barbara Lucas Roberts grew up on Jefferson Street. That is now the location of the New York State Museum. She was 12 years old when her family was forced out of their home.
Just knowing that that area was where I lived, where we lived, and the house was demolished to prepare for that area. There were families, there were friendships that were attached to all of that.
State records tell us that 6,800 people approximately were displaced for the South Mall. 3,300 dwelling units, several hundred businesses, 400 businesses.
All of these places, any place you look at an urban renewal project, a disproportionate number of the people who are displaced are Black and are poor, or poor. And those are the people for whom finding replacement housing is hardest. I mean, it's hard to lose your childhood home. It's hard to move away from all your friends. I mean, there's so many things that you lose with that. And that it wasn't a choice on the part of your family is even harder.
On the one hand, federal government made urban renewal money available to cities to demolish large chunks of so-called slums or so-called blighted areas. On the other hand, the federal government also said, okay, look, if you're going to displace people for urban renewal, you need to have replacement housing ready to go for them. You need to have, and we'll help you with the public housing. More often than not, though, urban renewal projects tore stuff down and kicked people out of their apartments and their homes, and didn't provide sufficient or early enough replacement housing. So I'm not aware of, in our research, I'm not aware of any urban renewal project that successfully relocated people from an urban renewal area after demolition immediately into replacement housing. There is usually a lag of several months or even several years. And this gets you to Ezra Prentice.
this neighborhood is a good neighborhood. It's just our quality of air has gone down.
Asthma is a disease that has an initial, something causes it, and then it's like can be a lifelong disease, and it gets triggered. So we know that certain types of pollution both are initiating causes of asthma and also ongoing triggers for asthma attacks. We know the prevalence of asthma in the South End is higher than in other areas of Albany. That actually is part of community health assessments that have been done for the county and the region.
I've been down here since I was a little kid. I'm born and raised down here.
And you've always had asthma?
Always had asthma. So it ain't, and my asthma actually is getting worse now. They just switched my asthma medicine. So, I don't know.
So we conducted the survey from 2016 to 2018 at Ezra Prentice, surveying households on numerous different health issues that they had, also food access issues, which brought some other interesting things to light. How we organized the survey, how we administered the survey was we had resident outreach workers that were trained, and they went and talked to their neighbors and told them about it and invited them to participate in it. And so I think that really helped participation. We did a comparison group at Creighton Story Homes, which is a similar public housing complex located in the South End, but instead of being next to, in the southernmost tip with the port on one side, split down the middle by a busy state highway, bounded by two interstate highways. Creighton Story is in a much more residential neighborhood and is surrounded by trees and a big garden. And so we use that as a comparison group. I will say this is preliminary data. It is currently being prepared for peer review, and so it's pre-publication. But what we have observed is a 34% rate of asthma, prevalence of asthma at Ezra Prentice among residents there, and a 21% prevalence at Creighton Story. And so these are, similar demographics, but the one difference is the air that they're breathing and what's around them. And so it's evidenced by a 34% across the board. That's more than 1 in 3 people.
Sometimes you could be sitting outside and you smell this smell, and you'd be like, what is that? And it's like something coming from the train. But then you got the exhaust from all them trucks and stuff.
Every year I gotta clean all the soot off my screens in the window, because if my autistic son sticks his face on the screen, it'll be all black on his face. It's nasty. It's just so sad. And the train's still going. I mean, it's all, I don't understand what stopped. I heard they rerouted the trucks. It doesn't look that way to me. So.
Yeah, like when they be running under the bridge and they honk it, I start to pull because that's all the smoke that's going in my lungs and I can't hold that much.
Yeah.
So yeah, and they messing me up too. They messing up my health.
Yeah. My sister got COPD, and she lives right back there by the tracks. Wow. And before she came down here, she wasn't like that. We wasn't like that. We was out partying and dancing and having a good old time. Now, it's like, especially her, mine is getting worse, but hers is where she can barely walk around because she can't breathe. Yeah.
studies were really prompted by the community's own concerns about their air quality, and also what were the sources of the potential pollution in the area. So the community was concerned about the traffic, they were concerned about the port, they were concerned about the rail traffic. So those were the three things that they really brought up as attention to us. And I give a lot of credit to the community for advocating for themselves to actually draw attention that enabled us to do the study and understand better what was going on there. The objective of this study was to understand exactly what are the sources that are impacting Ezra Prentice. And the main thing that we learned is that the largest impact comes from the traffic-related air pollutants. So it's the traffic that's moving past Ezra Prentice. In particular, we even learned that it's not about the amount of traffic, it's specifically the truck traffic. And the truck traffic there is very different than it is throughout all the South End. So we surveyed the entire South End, both the environmental justice and non-environmental justice areas. We found that the levels of emissions were relatively similar all across those areas, with the exception of Ezra Prentice, and that everything really points at the high quality number of trucks which were coming through. So it's over 1,000 trucks a day, and I believe up to about 1,700 a day. That's something that was actually determined by the community themselves. So a really great thing that they did was not only express their concerns, but they went out as citizen scientists and they collected data, and they were able to come to the city and the state and say, we've measured 1,000 trucks a day that are coming through here. When we did this study, we really verified using our equipment what they had actually found out for themselves.
I used to sit out the window and count to like 20 and then see how many trucks. I couldn't get to 20 without a big truck coming by.
I mean, what we're gonna do, we can't afford to, just pick up and move someplace in a nice area, with the rent being so high, Can't afford that, so we gotta stay here. Ain't got no choice. Just stay here and wither away to nothing. That's the only thing I can say.
So I would like options like if you don't want to be in this area where you're not going to do anything about the air quality, then help us relocate. Because some families can't be in that. I mean, whether you can take it out, some people can't be in that. It's bad enough there's like no backyards. My kids can barely play outside as it is. So it's, I don't know. I would like the option and assistance getting out of here.
There's no question from the research that poor air quality is correlated with both race and socioeconomic status. That's been shown across the country, and I think it's something that we're now paying much more attention to here in DEC and also in New York State and throughout the country.
When the initial environmental justice studies started coming out, looking at marginalized communities and pollution, there was a very, very clear link that particularly low-income Black communities, Latinx communities tended, if you took out a map and marked where these communities were and where toxic waste dumps were and where different sources of egregious pollution were, there was very direct correlations, and that's really where environmental justice, looking at that, those were the first studies that came out, and there's incredibly clear links.
In the areas with older housing stock, you're more likely to have industries move in that cause pollution. There's also a not in my backyard phenomenon. I'm sure you've heard of it, NIMBY. I am unlikely to agree for them to build a train through my neighborhood, right? I have political power, that other people don't have, right? And that's being used to determine how we build our environment. And that is one of the components of structural racism, obviously. It's the political power of communities that live together, because you live near people who are like you. And those communities build up political power and use that political power to protect their community.
Fossil fuels have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho, ho! Fossil fuels have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Fossil fuels have got to go!
We're talking about 3 times the likelihood of African Americans having asthma. We're talking about the increase of the bodily harm based on stress. Because if you're breathing polluted air, it's a stress on your body. If you walk out your door and you're worried about the police confronting you, it is a stress on your body.
We're a state agency. What we learn here at Ezra Prentice is something that we can really apply to many other environmental justice communities. So the folks at Ezra Prentice did not just advocate for themselves, and they did not just advocate for the South End. Everything that we've learned from working here and continuing to work here is going to help other communities just like them.
I think when we talk about the concept of environmental justice, it's really important to keep in mind both that environmental harms should be shared equitably across society, and environmental benefits should be shared equitably across society. And it's that balance of those two things that's very, very askew currently.
I wanted to just ask the group here if you had, if there were a couple things that stood out for you in this film which we just showed. What instances of environmental racism did you see there, or that you see in your own communities?
It struck me how blatant it is, and yet how unrecognized it is probably by a large part of the population of Albany. I can't imagine areas of Loudonville having that kind of traffic without there being an uproar. And yet it's been going on for so many years. I was not living in Albany during the construction of the Empire Plaza, but I've heard stories about it and the relocation of whole segments of the community, the African-American community, as well as other ethnic groups that were just uprooted with very little reimbursement and the delay in public housing being built. So it always amazes me that those things happen and then we just go on with life as if they didn't happen. So that is, to me, just, it's incredible when you put it all together.
Right.
I just wanted to mention that the South End, in 1932, the federal government had it as a red-lined district because there were, quote unquote, too many Black people in the South End. So that legacy has continued, as is true of also Arbor Hill and West Hill. You can trace from 1932 to the present that really very little has changed.
We struggle with these disparities all over the country, but certainly we find this in the Bronx, for instance, when they built the Bronx Expressway, which continues to just emit horrible, toxins that really raise asthma and cancer rates in that area. And a lot of times we run these highways right down the middle of historically Black neighborhoods. And we did that in Buffalo. We did that in Syracuse. You have an instance of that in Rochester. We certainly did that in Albany with 787, running through. And then, it just goes right on down. And you're not going to run the Bronx Expressway through an affluent white neighborhood. Okay, well, we could probably spend the rest of the time reflecting on these themes, but I just wanted to give you a taste of the challenges that we face when we talk about environmental and climate justice, because a lot of times the burdens which are borne are often carried by communities of color or people who are disenfranchised or poor, and we've made intentional policy choices that have impacted those communities, and we have a responsibility to reverse those choices and make some better choices where environmental harm and benefits are more equitably shared. So at this time, I'm going to invite Ann Ray to come and reflect with us about pending state legislation And Anne Ray is with NYPIRG, and she used to work for what was it, Anne? The
New York State Defenders Association.
The New York State Defenders Association, doing amazing work to try to pass bail reform and then hold on to the gains that we made in bail reform. But now she's working with NYPIRG. So we're just thrilled that you could be here, Anne, and we're gonna let you have the floor.
Oh, thanks, Peter. I should just mention that Roger Cook and I actually worked back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. I was the director of a grassroots coalition of 100 community groups, Citizens Environmental Coalition, working on Superfund, brownfield, and other pollution problems. And Roger was the director of the Western New York Council on Occupational Safety and Health. And he and I and some others created a New York State Labor Environment Network, which we're trying to regenerate, hopefully, in terms of taking on climate. But the New York State Labor Environment Network did a fabulous job for over a decade, working on corporate welfare reform and pollution prevention, et cetera. So it's great to be back at NYPIRG and working on environmental issues. I'm going to go over sort of the 10 key climate budget and climate policy bills that we'll be pushing for this session. We, as in a number of statewide climate coalitions. So I'm going to share the screen here, the PowerPoint, to give you some more detail. Great, everyone see that? Okay. So yeah, this obviously first, just a background in terms of, the United Nations this spring came out with another scientific report that the climate crisis is in code red for humanity, and that we must reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 50% in the next 7 years, or we will not have a livable planet. So New York is blessed that in 2019, a large environmental justice coalition of groups passed through the legislature, and the governor signed the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And there are the timetables. Those are the benchmarks that we have to do so that we have a livable New York State. The first one, of course, is 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And also 2030, 70% of electricity produced through renewable energy. So the bills we're going to talk about focus on those, meeting those two critical goals. The main sources of greenhouse gases in New York: buildings, heating and cooling buildings, 32% comes from the building sector, greenhouse gas emissions, 28% from transportation, etc. So it's very clear what sectors we really want to focus on in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act that was passed overwhelmingly this election day is taking a good first step in terms of providing some money towards climate change mitigation, flood risk reduction. You see there, there's clean electric school buses, planting street trees, retrofitting public buildings to improve energy efficiency and air filtration. It'll generate 84,000 green jobs, and it will also provide communities with funds in terms of flood risk reduction, in terms of updating water and sewer lines to deal with flooding, and maintaining and improving water treatment plants. But it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. It's been estimated by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority that we need at least $10 billion a year to implement our Climate Act, the 2019 law. Other organizations estimate 15 billion plus. And so it's that's one thing that it's sort of a moving target, but that we know that we have to raise at least 10 billion, if not 15 billion a year. So we can fully implement the Climate Act. So Clean Water, Clean Air, Green Jobs Act, took a good first step, but it's nowhere near enough. What we have coming out in January is the final scoping plan by the Climate Action Council, 22-member council that was created by the Climate Act. And it's basically, the scoping plan is a roadmap to implement the Climate Act. So it's going to have very specific recommendations on energy efficiency, transitioning from fossil fuel to electrification in buildings, zero emissions electricity, transitioning to renewable energy and the investments that are required, transportation electrification, et cetera. And it's a really critical blueprint that the fossil fuel industry is trying to undermine and weaken as we speak. So there's been a lot of climate organizations attending the weekly meetings of the Climate Action Council to push back, because the fossil fuel industry is, for instance, trying to weaken the recommendation on all new electric buildings and to punt and push that off for a number of years. And that'll mean we won't reach the 2030 reduction goals. The first bill of the 10 is the All Electric New Buildings Act. This bill did not pass last session, but it gained a lot of tractions, and it's a very important common sense first step strategy to decarbonize our buildings, the largest greenhouse gas emitters, the building sector. So it requires, starting January 1st, 2024, that all new buildings, not existing, but just new buildings, be all electric, not fueled by gas or propane or kerosene, but all electric. And that's smaller buildings that are 7 floors or under. And then in 2027, 3 years later, larger buildings, 7 floors or higher. This is the exact same timetable that the New York City All Electric New Buildings Act law that passed last year has. And basically, you know, it's going to result in advanced codes for all electric resilient new building construction on a time frame to substantially reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, New Yorkers, it will lower their energy costs. There's been 3 studies done this year showing that it's up to $8,000 cheaper to heat your home and cool your home with a geothermal heat pump than with gas. So it's the wave of the future, and this is a top priority bill on the top priority greenhouse gas emitting building sector. The transportation sector, 28%. Electrify New York, which is a coalition of Sierra Club and other environmental groups working on transportation, is pushing for the green transit and the green jobs bills. And basically it requires all public transit agencies like MTA to purchase only zero emission buses by 2029. And in terms of green jobs, to use best value procurement of zero emission buses to create good green jobs. So it's another really important sector specific bill that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then the third policy bill is called the Gas Transition and Affordable Energy Act. And this is a priority of Renewable Heat Now Coalition, a coalition of over 40 organizations, and New York Renews, a coalition of over 300 organizations. And I should just back up and mention that the All Electric Building Act is the priority for the Renewable Heat Now Coalition, which NYPIRG is a member of, and many other great statewide and regional environmental and climate justice groups. So the Gas Transition Act basically is a roadmap for the Public Service Commission, directing them to work with all the utilities to establish gas transition plans to align gas utilities with the Climate Act's greenhouse gas emission reduction. In other words, phase out the use of fossil fuels. And eliminate subsidies for new gas hookups. Why should we be spending money when we're going to have stranded assets, basically, with these new gas hookups? They're not going to, we can't have them continue. We need to phase them out. And it ensures that no household pays more than 6% of their income for energy in terms of protecting low and moderate income families. And then we have the Energy Efficiency, Equity, and Jobs Act, which is an environmental justice bill that WE ACT in Harlem has taken the lead on, and also the Renewable Heat Now Coalition. And this basically deploys funding for cost-saving energy efficiency retrofits in low-income communities and communities of color, ensures workers are hired for those upgrades they come from those disadvantaged communities, and also allows NYSERDA, the state agency, to fund non-energy measures like removing lead and mold contamination. So it's a really win-win in terms of putting together not just energy efficiency retrofitting, but cleaning up these old apartment buildings, these old buildings going back to the 30s that have lead and mold and other problems. And then the next bill is not sector specific, but it basically lays the groundwork for a transition to a renewable, democratically controlled, publicly owned energy system to build new large-scale renewables. And it does that by requiring the New York Power Authority, state-owned power authority, to own and build new renewable generation, storage, and transmission, so that they will only be providing renewable energy by 2030. And they will be providing renewable energy to all state-owned and municipal properties by 2035. And this is supported by New York Renews and Green Jobs New York. Now we get on the budget bills. So this is a bill that NYPIRG has taken the lead on. We worked on this. First, we tried to pass this in Congress, and Senator Manchin, killed it. So we're now trying to make New York, Maryland, and Massachusetts building block states to pass this Make Polluters Pay Climate Change Superfund Act. And what it does is similar to the Superfund, federal and state Superfund toxic waste cleanup program, where sites where there's not a known polluter, they call them orphan sites, that basically collect fees assessed on the chemical and oil industries in New York State, go into the Superfund, and they use that money to clean up those orphan leaking toxic waste dumps. Same concept here, polluters pay, which is national polls show is still very strongly supported by people. It requires the fossil fuel companies, the big gas and oil companies in New York State, to fund a polluters pay fee based on their share of past greenhouse gas emissions going back the past 18 years. There's new scientific studies that allow us to allocate their share, ExxonMobil's share of greenhouse gas emissions in the last 18 years in New York. And it would generate an estimated $3 billion a year or $30 billion over the next 10 years. So it's a really just and fair approach and ensures that part of the state's climate crisis programs are funded by the industry that created from and profited from the climate crisis. And there's a list here of, what the fund can be used for, upgrades to stormwater drainage and sewage treatment systems in terms of flooding, massive statewide upgrades to roads and bridges, subways and transit systems, and responding to heat waves, air and water pollution, and other climate crisis related impacts. And the next budget related bill is called Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act, another New York Renews priority. And basically, it's a big first step to eliminate the most egregious and non-essential subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, totaling an estimated $330 million every year. Some of the exemptions are basically $118 million in exemptions for airline fuels, exemptions for petroleum, $65 million, tax and sale exemptions. So there's a lot of subsidies that have been going on for decades to prop up the fossil fuel industry. At the same time, they're making massive record profits this year in terms of the oil and gas industries with their huge increases in terms of gasoline, et cetera. So Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act is another just and fair climate bill. And we will save the state $336 million by passing this bill. There are two other funding bills, and this is, as Peter mentioned, and some of you attended, New York Renews held a series of news events yesterday to launch their Climate Jobs and Justice for New York package. It's a great logo there from New York Renews, and it includes two legislative proposals that have not been finally drafted. So I don't have a lot of information on them. The Climate and Community Protection Fund is pool of money to fund the Climate Act, and then the Invest in Our New York revenue and spending package from the Invest in Our New York Coalition eliminates wasteful handouts to businesses like the subsidies and ensures the wealthiest pay. And then the other two are what we just discussed, the Climate Change Superfund Act, Make Polluters Pay, and that Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act. So one more budget bill, and then we'll sort of do a summary, take questions. Renewable Heat Now Coalition, which focuses just on the building sector, the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, has come up with some proposals to help low to moderate income households, to aid them in electrifying existing homes and getting ready for that new electric building construction starting in 2024. So they've come up with a proposal for a green, affordable, free electrification gap fund for low and moderate income households in terms of hazard remediation, electrical upgrades, weatherization, energy efficiency, and when appliances meet their end life, replacing them with all electric appliances. And they're also looking at having the New York State Energy Research Development Authority to work in partnership with the New York Green Bank to provide upfront funds to upgrade buildings and obtain tax credits, rebates, and incentives, and to provide 0% interest loans to low to moderate income households and low interest loans to all other households. Again, packaging them together with hazard remediation in terms of lead, asbestos, mold, pests, et cetera, in old houses, with improved structural maintenance, with electrification to enable weatherization and electrification, and lift up those low and moderate income households as we transition into a renewable energy future. So we basically, the 10 key climate policy and budget bill summary, I wanted to give, some recommendations in terms of how the New York State Council of Churches might prioritize these 10 policy and budget bills. In terms of funding the Climate Act, the two bills that have been introduced and have solid support and are moving and have very specific targets in terms of money that they will raise is the Climate Change Superfund Act. That's $30 billion over 10 years. And the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act, that's saving $336 million annually for New York State. Those other three bills that New York Renews and the Renewable Heat Now Coalition are advocating, the amounts to be determined, and the bills are still in the proposal and or drafting stage. And then on the implementing Climate Act, the policy side, I would recommend, we focus on the two biggest sectors in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's the All Electric New Buildings Act, the building sector, and the transportation sector, the Green Transit and Green Jobs Bill, as well as it's now time for the Public Service Commission to tell the utilities like National Grid, who are basically fighting tooth and nail to not transition to a renewable energy future. It's time to say, look, guys, you got to come up with a gas transition plan. And so the Gas Transition and Affordable Energy Act is basically dealing with the energy sector for New York State. So those are three, I think, really key bills that are the most impactful in terms of implementing the Climate Act and achieving that 40% reduction greenhouse gas emissions in 7 years. It's kind of scary. We only have 7 years to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And as of 2019, which is the last data that the DEC had in their report on greenhouse gas reduction last year, we've only achieved 6.5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a way to go, and these three policy bills will get us there, the most impactful way to get us there. Then there are two bills that are important, but they don't address a specific sector, and that's the New York Power Authority, making it an energy renewable focused authority, and the Energy Efficiency and Equity in Jobs Act. So I'll end there, and I hope I didn't talk too fast. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but
Great.
Yeah.
That's really great, Anne. Thank you. This is a very confusing space to work in. So to have somebody, line this out so clearly as you just did is really a welcome contribution. So thank you. Before I invite people to ask questions of Anne, there are two other people I'd like to speak briefly on a couple of other policy issues. And one of them is Ruth Foster from the divestment movement. And Ruth, I wanted to know if you could share with us a little bit about some of the divestment legislation that you're working on.
Sure, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. And that was a great presentation. Anne really covered a lot of ground. There is one more bill that I would like to add to the package, and that's the the Teachers Fossil Fuel Divestment Act, which is, I don't think I have the numbers in front of me, but it is an act that would require the teachers, the New York State Teachers Retirement System to divest its $4.5 billion from fossil fuels. And Divest New York has been around for a few years. We started out by fighting to get the New York City pensions to divest, and we won that fight, and they are currently divesting from fossil fuels. Then we fought DiNapoli, and DiNapoli is, Controller DiNapoli is now divesting the Common Retirement Fund from fossil fuels. And so the second largest pension fund, public pension fund in New York is the New York State Teachers Retirement System. And we are currently in a campaign to get them to divest. We've been very active for the last 2 years, and they aren't budging much, so we can really use a lot of help. And what we have done in the past 2 years is we've gotten the New York State United Teachers, the teachers union, to pass resolutions 3 years in a row in favor of divestment. We've had 16 locals representing thousands of teachers pass resolutions for divestment. And we've done a coal report showing that the New York State Teachers Fund has increased its investments in coal as the climate crisis worsens. We've done petitions, sign-on letters, and the Teachers Fossil Fuel Divestment Act bill we had introduced last year. And I do have the bill numbers for that bill. It is Assembly Bill 6331, Assemblymember Kellis, and Senate Bill 4783, Senator Brisbord. And that both the bills together, we have about 70 sponsors already in the Assembly, and I think 25 or 26 in the Senate. So it's got a lot of support in the legislature, and we would love for the Teachers Retirement Board to divest on its own, but we don't think it's going to, and that's why we're really pushing the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. This year we have a lot of plans coming up. We are going to be getting new bill numbers for the bill. We are doing letters from teachers, are going to be sending in letters, we hope by the thousands. We just ran, one of our members just ran for the board of NYSTERS and got 14,000 votes as to be on the board. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough to win a seat on the board, but I think it's letting the board know that teachers want divestment. So that was very exciting. And I do want to kind of ditto what Anne said. The climate crisis is really a crisis. And when we talk about people in the world in danger, you know, there's stories that there are going to be literally millions of people at risk in Africa of starvation and due to drought in the next couple years, year or two. The Yangtze River in China dried up this year. That has never happened in history. If there's not water in China, how are we going to feed the world's population? I don't know. I find it really scary. And these hurricanes in Florida are basically forcing the rich people to move inland. And what happens when they do that? Because they can't live on the coast anymore, they're displacing poor and low-income families. And so there are many impacts of the climate crisis that are hurting, as always, people with poor people and people of color most. So we have found that just the general thought that our teachers are funding this climate crisis is just wrong. Students are going to be the future, and the teachers who teach the students are basically funding the destruction of the planet. And that is just a moral wrong. And then to that end, one of the things we're hoping that you can help us with, and I've been working with John Carlberg, and I want to thank also Roger Cook has been very active in our campaign. We are doing a faith sign-on letter. And if it's okay, I'm going to drop, it's still in draft form, so I hope you don't circulate it. But it's got, we're going to be hopefully by next week sending this out and about to everybody. So if you'd like to take a look at it, we might tweak it a little bit before, but we're hoping that we can get faith leaders from all over New York State to sign on to this letter, to go to the NYSTERS board, and to, we'll send it to the legislature also as a, hopefully as a push for them to pass the fossil fuel teachers fossil fuel divestment act. And in Anne's little chart about where the bill goes, we often think of our bill as a companion to the End Fossil Fuel Subsidies bill, and we've been marketing them for a couple of years as stop funding climate destruction, don't subsidize the fossil fuel industry through our tax dollars, and don't use our pension funds to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And since I'm talking, there is one other bill that's off topic, but I'm wondering if you can take a look at and consider, because it's a bill from an environmental justice community in Albany. The Sheridan Hollow Alliance for Renewable Energy spent a number of years fighting a proposed power plant that would have been built by New York State NYPA, and that community has been polluted for over a century from a power plant that burns fossil fuels in order to power the New York State Capitol building. So here we are, our state government is in a building that is polluting an environmental justice community in Albany. So the Sheridan Hollow Alliance for Renewable Energy is pushing a bill called the Renewable Capital Act. And it would require the New York State Capitol building to be funded by renewables. And we think that that's just common sense. Why are we polluting a neighborhood to power our New York State Capitol? And we're supposed to be a leader in environmental justice and in climate justice. So we need our capital to be run by renewable energy. That bill is S8221 Breslin. And I'll send this information to people. And A9341 McDonald. It will be introduced by Fahey next session. So sorry for slipping that in, but I thought it's a really good bill.
Very good.
It just fit with the Ezra Prentice. Everybody in downtown Albany is just getting dumped with pollution, and that's not right.
And it makes it a nice dozen key
Okay.
bills. I should just mention, we also have a sign-on letter on the Climate Superfund Polluters Pay Bill.
Okay.
And you guys, when I send you my PowerPoint, thanks.
So the final person I'd like to ask speak briefly to us is Abby Nash from the Jubilee New York campaign. And Abby, would you like to share a few reflections with us?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I know you have lots to take in tonight, lots of good information on a lot of important legislation. So again, I'm Abby Nash, and I'm the Senior Director of Organizing at Jubilee USA, which is a development organization committed to helping the most vulnerable. And we see debt relief and restructuring as a way to do that. We're very well aware of the record heat waves, floods, and natural disasters from this year. And we know that if we fail to take action to address climate change, that we'll see increasingly worse impacts from this climate crisis on the poor here in New York, across the country, and also around the world. So the legislation that we're working on is to address developing countries' debt, which is at a 50-year high. We know that dozens of developing countries are struggling with the burden of these debts. And that makes it impossible for them to not just crawl out of poverty and address critical needs, but to address climate mitigation and adaptation. These debts include loans from other countries, but a significant number of these debts also come from wealthy investors who lend money to financially distressed countries at high interest rates. And these debt instruments, over half of them come from New York State. So the US and other allied countries have set up protocols to cut the debt of countries that can't pay their bills and put forward a solid economic plan. But the private lenders, like I said, which hold 60% of debt in these developing countries, for the most part have refused to provide their share of debt relief. So we're working on a legislative campaign also with Pat Fahey, which would ensure equitable burden sharing among both the public and private lenders. This legislation, which will be reintroduced by Pat, is called the New York Taxpayer and International Debt Crises Protection Act. It was Assembly Bill 10595. And we appreciate being here because we just thought that addressing climate and other environmental issues just sort of fits right in. And we know that Pope John Paul II, other diverse faith-based leaders championed debt forgiveness for the poor, and that it's been a longstanding US policy with bipartisan support ever since. And I also heard earlier today someone mention Laudato Si, but we know that Pope Francis is championing debt relief and environmental investments, and so thought that this would be a good group to promote this legislation with. We think it has the ability to have a really positive impact both on investments and impacting the lives of millions and millions of people across the world, but also impacting New Yorkers by addressing, economic shocks like increased gas and food prices here in New York. So we also have a petition, and we're looking for people to join our campaign to start talking to their legislators, get some sign-ons, and move this bill. Thanks.
And we will be doing, thank you, Abby, a full seminar on this in January, where we'll be able to go into this particular piece of legislation in a lot more depth. So thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to ask for some reactions to what you've heard, and I'm going to invite actually Roger Cook to offer the first reflections and question here, and then invite others to do that. We'll do that for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to move to the next part of our program. So Roger.
Thanks, Peter. In addition to working with organized labor in Western New York, I also worked with the faith community. Back when Love Canal first emerged, we formed the Ecumenical Task Force of the Niagara Frontier. So the faith community did join with the labor and environmental community in advocating for clean up those Superfund sites across the state. And we did it out of moral conviction. We felt that it was morally imperative that we stop exposing people to toxic waste. And so it was really a pleasure to work with Ann and also my good friend Lee Smith when we worked a little bit on the Right to Know bill way back then. So I'm convinced that the faith community has both a responsibility and an opportunity to move the kind of bills forward that Ann and Ruth have just brought up, and I think that I would just summarize very quickly. I think the opportunities and the task before us to organize and mobilize people in the faith community to do such things as testify at the Assembly and Senate labor legislative hearings on the Climate Action Council's final scoping plan in the fourth week of January, and that we prioritize some of the bills that Ann mentioned. That further, we hold a faith-based climate justice lobby day in February, and I know, Peter, we're committed to doing that, but the job will now be to organize and mobilize our leadership and our members and congregations to really participate in that lobby day and to advocate for our priority bills that Ann and Ruth just mentioned. I think the other opportunity we have is to testify at the Assembly and Senate budget hearings on those budget bills that Ann raised, which will be held in, I believe, Ann, in mid-February, especially on the Superfund bill and on the All-Electric Building Act. And then finally, Ann had brought up with me, and I had not known much about this, but there's a pastor, and maybe some of you know Pastor Waldron in Harlem, who holds a Justice Sunday event in which he talks for about 10 minutes to people about the issues, and then they get on their computers or their phones and they email and tweet. And I think for a criminal justice bill, they got 1,000 tweets. That might be something that we might want to use as a model. So it's a lot of work, but it's the kind of work that I think has big impact. I know when we lobby as a faith community, our legislators tend to acknowledge who we are, and that we carry a special kind of weight at those lobby days. So often they say we're hearing from the environmentalists, but we don't hear from anybody else. And I think that's where we really have a role to play. So I won't go on and on because I don't want to hear other people, but I think those are some of the tasks, Peter, that we have before us as a faith community and an opportunity to make a difference.
Thank you, Roger. So any other questions or reflections on what you've heard as we head towards the 2023 legislative session? So I have a question. So Ann, earlier on, you said that there was a bit of a debate as to whether 10 or 15 billion was what was required. Could you say more about that and help us with the nuances of that conversation?
Sure. Basically, there's been a lack of leadership by the governor and the state agencies responsible for putting together basically an action plan and a budget to implement the Climate Act and meet those goals. So at the budget hearings last February, Senator Krueger, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, she asked NYSERDA and the DEC, I would like you to give me an accounting of how much the state is spending currently on climate mitigation and protection. And they sent her a letter, and so she's tallying up that amount. But what she's planning to do is hold a hearing that Roger had mentioned, hold a hearing at the end of January to basically require the state agencies and the governor's office to really parse out exactly what the budget is needed for 2023, for 2024, going forward in terms of implementing those climate policy reforms, and in terms of knowing what are the priority budget bills we have to pass in 2023 to start to generate 10 or 15 billion, whatever it works out to be. So we're blessed that we have the leadership of Senator Krueger and also Assemblymember Weinstein, who's the chair of the Assembly Ways and Means Committee. They're holding the feet to the fire of the state agencies and the governor to basically figure out what is the bill, what is the tab that we have to pay annually to do everything the Climate Act requires, including 35 to 40% focused on disadvantaged communities, people of color, low-income communities that are most at risk of flooding, for instance, in the 5 boroughs of New York City. So it's a sort of a to be determined situation, but we at least know that NYSERDA has said 10 billion as of their study last year. And we know that a number of statewide organizations in doing their research have determined up to 15 billion in terms of additional programs, like that Energy Equity and Jobs Act, for instance.
Okay, great.
Peter, just one quick interjection. You know, the Love Canal task force of the Niagara Frontier, which was based around the Love Canal issue, got a meeting with Mario Cuomo back in, I think it was 1981 or 2, because they were expanding a chemical waste dump site right in the city of Niagara Falls. And we actually got a meeting with the governor, and he shut the chemical waste part of that dump down. So I'm just thinking we might think in those terms, trying to get a meeting directly with the governor and as the faith community, because we did move Mario Cuomo. Of course, he was a special governor, but we might have that same opportunity with Hochul. And I think maybe we should explore that.
Okay. Dahlia, I see you have your hand raised.
Right. I have also a budgetary question, which is because that comes first, is the governor's budget. And the two budgetary items that you particularly highlighted were ones that would be savings for New York State. Isn't that correct?
One is a saving, right? The fossil fuel subsidy eliminations. The other is actually creating a super fund, a climate super fund, fees on the big oil and gas companies.
Right. So for those two, I mean, that puts us in a strong position to argue for them. Is there such pushback from the fossil fuel industry that Hochul will fold? I mean, what is really going on there as far as the governor is concerned?
Well, for the last year, we've been meeting with the governor's staff on the Climate Superfund proposal. She chose not to include it in her last session's budget. But we're hoping, we've done a lot of legal research and economic research. It will not increase in consumer prices. So we're hoping, we're going to be meeting with her basically in the next month, her staff, to see if she will consider putting this in her executive budget, as well as the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Elimination Act. Basically the way the legislature works these days, you want to get your policy and your budget bills in the executive budget, as you know, Dahlia, because that's right. That's where you have leverage to pass those bills into law in the budget.
Right. So again, I guess I would ditto what Roger was saying about while NYPIRG may be doing those kinds of meetings, I think that would be really valuable if we could get to the governor on these issues too early.
It would be fantastic. And we can help in terms of John O'Leary, who's the Energy Deputy Secretary in Council, and also Liz Fine, who's the Chief of Staff, who used to work for Assembly Member Weprin, and she's very approachable.
Thank you.
My understanding, because of the election, is the governor has an extra couple weeks to assemble the budget. I think that's helpful to know as we try to make our voice known before her. But so much of this work gets handled even before the legislative session starts, as Anne said, getting this included in the budget. We're going to move to our next section, but I wanted to ask if we had one or two additional questions. Yeah, Catherine, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is really for Roger in his comments about I can't remember what the comments were, but this is when the question occurred. When we bring groups into lobby these, either the governor or, our legislators, it will be, am I right, that it will be important that with all that's been said about those that the underserved neighbors, that they be included in those meetings. Am I correct on that? And are there any ideas on how to enlist their support and their willingness to come and be part of this process?
Well, that's the eternal question, right? Particularly in the environmental movement, which can have the feeling of privilege, and sometimes a division between, advocates and then people who are low wealth or who live in communities that are affected by these environmental disparities. And so, I think we constantly have to be thinking about how we empower folks to offer their voice. I think that is really a model for the Poor People's Campaign, which they try to embrace really very intentionally. And I think there are things that we can learn from that.
And also, Ruth's group, for instance, Environmental Justice Group in Sheridan Hollow, is right in Albany. I think there's a number of environmental justice groups that would be ecstatic to be invited to a faith-based lobby day and join with you, Sister Catherine. So I would let us know. We can give you a short list of environmental justice groups that are, trenches being impacted now.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we're going to move to the next section of our seminar, and I would like to now introduce to you Rob Crotteroof from Crotteroof and Associates, and also Lee Smith, who is with American Solar Partners, if I recall that I have that name correct. And they're going to reflect with us a little bit about the federal legislation, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, and also some of the other incentives which are available to help communities employ clean energy technology as part of their work and as part of their building plans as we move forward. So Lee and Rob, I'm going to invite you to offer a few reflections.
Okay, well, I'll be brief because you've had a lot of material. I have a couple of main points to make. Now, I've been in the solar business for over 12 years. And before that, I worked in state government. I worked for Mario Cuomo for 12 years. And originally was in Western New York, where I worked with Roger and others on issues related to toxic chemicals. So I have a feel for some of these issues. The good news is that the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this summer is the single most powerful incentive program to build the new renewable energy infrastructure, to build the solar, to install it on homes, to install it on buildings, to build wind, to do a whole range of things. And it's going to really unleash a 10-year boom of investment in building and job creation. We need to get away from fossil fuels, but at the same time, we have to have the renewables in place to keep powering our society and delivering energy to people, because energy is such an essential part of our economy. And the solar and wind industries are growing rapidly. Their costs are lower. They're driving coal-fired power plants out of business. Soon they'll drive natural gas plants out of business because they're more competitive, more economical. The state has a big program on offshore wind that is well underway. And then what's happened with the federal legislation, and it's particularly relevant for churches, for not-for-profits, for the public sector. If you invest in a renewable energy project and you're a church, you can now get 30% of the cost of that project paid for as a grant from the federal government through the IRS. And it's not an application, it's a matter of what they call as of right. If you make the investment, you file the form, you get the money. I mean, it has to be put into service, it has to work, obviously. It's 30% is the base. If you use domestic content, like you use solar modules made in the United States, it's 40%. So that means that if you've already got 40% of your costs covered. And it makes it very viable in any place where you have a high cost of energy. And, you know, the sad fact is that with the exception of the Rochester area, we have a high cost of power everywhere in the state, particularly downstate. And so these projects are going to be very viable. The economics of them are very attractive. I'm currently working on projects in the city. We have a proposal pending with the mayor for 150 schools. There's going to be a boom of investment in building that is going to transform the energy system. And if you tie these projects to what's called pre-apprenticeship programs, that is a program where you get young people involved in learning a skill, learning a trade, whether it's a sheet metal worker or a plumber or an electrician. There's a lot of opportunity to link job creation for disadvantaged communities under what President Biden calls the Justice 40 initiative. So, you know, I have a slide presentation. It's a lot of slides, you know, and Peter Cook has the slide presentation. He can share it with everybody, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. But it's something you should be aware of because it's relevant to you as a member of a parish. It's relevant to you as someone involved with not-for-profit organizations. And I'm working with people in New York that are going to put together a bill that mandates that the public sector, state and local government, start making the energy efficiency and the solar investments using the federal legislation. There's no excuse now. This idea we don't have the money, that's out the window. You've got the money. The federal government's going to be there 40 cents of every dollar if you use domestic content. So the challenge is going to be to get people to learn about it and to start making the plans that you need. You know, building renovation projects are not trivial. Anybody who's been involved in a church project where you're going to put on a new roof or get a new boiler or anything, it's complicated. And you got to think it through and you got to have the studies. But it's very feasible because the technology has really improved and the costs have come way down from what they were 10 years ago. And in the presentation that I shared with Peter, there's a couple of examples of churches that have done this. There's also a simple worksheet that illustrates how the math works. It also applies to energy efficiency. So we're very bullish on what can be done. We think that the not-for-profit and public sector can lead the way to start making these investments and start, you know, as I think Ann said or somebody said, we're only 6.5% there. Well, we can do a lot better. And now we've got the federal government fully committed to this. And as I mentioned before, this is as of right. This is not a grant that you apply for. It's not a long process. it's just like everything else with the IRS. You fill out the form, and if you fill it out correctly, you're going to get the money.
Okay.
It's a great program.
So Rob, would you like to offer some further reflections about what was just said here with regards to the IRA and also other kinds of incentives?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Yeah, to start about the IRA and to put it into some context, then I mean, we've been working for the last almost 10 years trying to find creative structures for affordable housing owners to be able to own solar projects or third parties to come in. And it was very difficult because there would be a long payback where you would need to have a tax equity investor come in and may have a partnership. And it was just, it's very difficult. Now we're seeing an entirely different landscape. For especially for not-for-profits, also for-profit organizations, then these tax credits can be transferred. So it's possible for for-profit organizations that don't have the tax appetite to be able to still access those benefits, which we find again in affordable housing, where there are especially where property owners may not have the tax appetite for various reasons, or it's too complex. So another party can come in and provide that benefit in a much more simplified way than before. Well, what does this mean on a dollars and cents basis? It used to be maybe a 10 to 15 year payback for a project. So it would be marginal, right? Maybe something that would be done on a mission basis, but even then it could be difficult to justify. Now we're looking at potentially 3 to 5 year payback periods, maybe a little bit longer. So it's simply a good economic decision. It's a very different calculus. So this brings us to really, rather than the individual pilot projects, as Lee was saying, it really is the moment to scale. Between the awareness that's been made, the fact that there have been pilot projects done, and the economics make a lot of sense. There are also third parties that can come in and allow us and fund the system if a property owner, if a church does not want to, or a house of worship does not want to have to come out of pocket, then there are other parties that will pay and provide energy at a discount. There are also, as we'll talk about with Peter, subscription opportunities to sign up for a solar project that's off-site. So there are so many different arrangements. On incentives, then at the federal level, the one other aspect to note is projects that are in a low-income community will be able to apply for an additional 10 to 20% tax credit above that 30 to 40% that Lee described. That will be on a competitive basis, but the rules are being established right now by the IRS. So we'll know about how to access those funds shortly. And on the state level, NYSERDA does have grants that they provide toward projects. And at the city level, then there's a property tax abatement worth up to 20% of a project, which houses of worship would not have that tax appetite. Some affordable housing property owners do. And so there could be benefit to that. And also there's local law 97 compliance. There's a building-based carbon cap, and solar is able to have a substantial benefit offsetting the solar on site, and if it's structured in a certain way, also to a project that is off site. So there's potential, the way the rules are drafted, there's actually almost double counting that's allowed for solar, understanding the substantial benefit of renewable energy in the city. So there's a whole stack of incentives. These are evolving over time fairly quickly, but the nutshell version is when all is said and done, then even today, then the numbers make a lot of sense, and we can move forwards with mission-based projects that also are economical.
Great. So I wanted to ask Lee briefly and then Rob briefly, if you could, in a very nuts and bolts way, explain your specific programs that you're offering. And so, Lee, I'll return back to you.
Okay, so what we do is if someone's interested in solar as solar power for their building, we help them assess the feasibility of it. Is it a good site? Do you get enough sun, etc.? We do a preliminary budget. We give them a rundown on how all the incentives work, and if they need financing, we can arrange the financing. We design the project, and then we use union contractors and American-made modules to execute the project. And we've been doing it for a number of years, and we've done a lot of different kinds of buildings. And when I started in the business, the cost of solar has come down several 100%, and the output of the modules has more than tripled. So the technology has improved and the costs have come down. It's really become very viable. But every project has to be scoped out. You just can't assume it. You got to put the numbers together and make an economic decision based upon the feasibility of it, the output, what your savings are going to be, etc. And that's what we do. We help building owners figure out if solar makes sense for them.
Okay, great. And Rob? Rob and I work together on a program which is funded through NYSERDA. Maybe you could explain a little bit how that program works.
Great, thanks, Peter. So we're working in partnership with Peter and the New York State Council of Churches in an owner's representative capacity, helping faith-based organizations and affordable housing property owners across the state to understand their energy needs and facilitate the adoption of solar energy in particular. That takes a couple different forms. One can be the consideration of on-site solar. So we'll conduct an evaluation and see, similar to what Lee was describing, to see what is the solar potential for a site, what are potential economic returns, and then we help to identify contractors such as Lee to be able to actually perform the work and can help to oversee that work in an independent capacity. An on-site project may not make sense in all cases. Perhaps a roof is old, but you're not ready to replace it. Perhaps there's a lot of shading. Perhaps there's just not the funding available to build a project. Then we also work to both help a house of worship and community facilities to sign up to community solar projects, and have worked with Peter and the council to develop a program with churches to be able to conduct community solar subscription outreach to their communities, so that, you know, one of the really exciting moments in time that we're in is that it's not just about advocacy now, it's about implementation. So as of the end of last year, there were 770 community solar projects under development across New York State, representing more than $3 billion of public and private investment, enough to power more than 400,000 homes. So there's a chance to actually actively participate in these projects, in addition to advocating for still more and still better policy. So signing up to these projects. Raise of hands very quickly. How many folks here have signed up or heard of community solar and being able to sign up to a project out of curiosity? Can look through. So a couple folks, at least of those who are on camera, a couple. So it's a very easy way to be able to both participate in a project. And Peter, why don't you explain a little bit about the structure and programming, because a very important part of this is it's not just like checklist sustainability of having a project and you get a discount on your bill and the state can say, yes, we're having lots of people participate, solar companies are making money. This is about active community partnerships and engagement and education and connecting projects to public policy. So Peter, why don't you talk specifically about those efforts?
Yeah. So as Rob said, when we go and work with a congregation, we really try to look at all of their options. Sometimes it's about hardware, and that makes sense. And sometimes it's not about hardware, but they still want to be able to get the benefit of solar. And so we're really there to help congregations be a blessing on their communities and to contribute to climate justice in the way that makes the most sense for them. So if the church does go in the community solar direction, we can build this into a stewardship campaign, for instance, for the church, where they sell subscriptions. They would, if you're upstate, it would get $100 per subscription that they sell, plus usually 10% discount on the electric bill. So it becomes a very practical vehicle to raise a little bit of money, but also to reach out to homeowners and renters in their community and have them, participate in this climate justice work. And all of this gets, linked back to the mission of the church, where, we really encourage congregations to weigh in on policy to create a more just world and to really get parishioners involved in shaping that policy. And the solar subscriptions becomes a vehicle for congregations to build relationships with other people, which is really the basis for doing, effective advocacy. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this time together. We are going to produce this recording. We're probably going to do a few edits, and then be able to share it around. So thank you, everyone, for your participation. And our next seminar will be on November 29th from 7 to 9 o'clock. And that seminar will be focusing on the issue of healthcare. Thank you very much.